company called Search Mojo. We're a search engine marketing firm, and we're headquartered in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we're going to talk about big data, SEO, and the future of mobile privacy. And I'm going to go ahead and let my panelists here introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their companies.
Sure. My name is Seth Dotterer. I run product and marketing for SEO platform company Conductor. We help organizations find opportunities, manage those workflow, and really capture those natural search places and then report on that to their organizations.
And I'm Jeff Steer. I'm the founder of a company called Quips. We have a platform that powers the spoken voice, your own voice, as an option for social self-expression. So photos, text, and video, why not voice? And the importance of that here is looking to the future. As more voice takes hold in the social sphere, the amount of data that's contained within voice is going to be unlocked. So data about age, data about sex, and also data about sentiment, emotion, and intent. And as that gets unlocked, there's going to be a huge play in the big data field.
My name is Will Uppington. I run product management and account management for a company called Bloomreach. I'm just recovering from a cold, so forgive me, my voice is not normally this gravelly. I'm not trying to do a Kathleen Turner impression or anything like that, but this is how I'm going to sound, unfortunately. Bloomreach is a company that's about 3 years old. We actually only developed our website a few months ago, so you may not have heard of us. But what we do is we have a platform that allows you to provide the most relevant content in your organic and paid search channels to improve your performance in those channels. And we're basically a team came out of the Google search quality team in order to try to improve user experience, leveraging a lot of the big data technologies that we're going to talk about.
Great. So we had a call last week, the panel and I had a little bit of conversation about what we wanted to talk about today. And one of the first things we wanted to really define was, we hear this term big data a lot, thrown around a lot, but how do each of you define what big data is?
If you don't mind, can I ask the audience how many people think they have a good handle on what big data is?
Anyone
Curious?
know what that means?
All right, so I think primarily it's used for VC and investment firms to get higher valuations for the companies. But so the technical definition of big data is where the amount or complexity of data that's coming in is larger than the scope of the available tools for the people receiving it. So you think back to before Excel had the more than 56,000 rows, right? That was a big data problem, was when you wanted to get more information and the tools you had didn't let you process it. So at Conductor, we think of big data sort of in three areas. There's problems in like just getting access to the data, whether that's I can't find the right connectivity, I can't connect to that API. There's the just massive, like the problem of storage, whether that's way too big, like I can't store all this in-house, or it's an unstructured data set, so I don't know how to store it. And then finally, the thing that we think is probably most interesting, which is the noise problem, which is that an in-house marketer doesn't have the tools today to be able to sort through like all the data that they have access to and find anything actionable on that. So that's how we think of it.
So I agree with all that as it applies specifically to voice. Understand that the ability for Siri, for example, to understand what you've asked and voice search is one level of complexity, and they do a pretty good job, but it's not perfect. Companies like Nuance and others are actually digging into the ability for people to self-express across all languages and understand intent and sentiment from that. And so you can imagine that once you start looking at that, the amount of data in all the areas that you just described that needs to be crunched in order to accurately deliver results that are searchable and that could help SEO is just huge. So voice fits into big data in that way.
No, that makes sense. And just to add a little bit to that, how many people have heard of technologies like MapReduce or Hadoop? Are those terms familiar? Can people just, okay, so a few people. So yeah, the big data, it actually came out because, mostly from a lot of the search engines, Google, Yahoo, because the basic IT platforms that they had, weren't scaling with the amount of data. So it really was a function of just having so much data. And so they developed a whole bunch of new technologies, new file systems, new database technologies, new processing technologies, So you'll hear, some of those things. Google invented something called MapReduce. Then there's an open source version of that called Hadoop. Those are for processing data. Then you have database technologies. Google has its Big Table. And then there are, again, open source versions of that called Cassandra. And others, a bunch of things. And you'll also hear this buzzword called NoSQL. And that's a big data technology as well. So, there's basically all these technologies were created out of necessity just because the existing relational databases and other platforms weren't scaling to be able to handle them. And the goal of big data, and I think that's what is most important to focus on, is to really understand what people want, how they're behaving, and what's the best thing to market to them to improve your marketing performance and your user experience. And one of the things I think we've got to make sure we focus on, in addition to using big data to improve marketing performance, is also to make sure we're using it in order to improve the user experience. And it can be a really powerful tool in terms of doing that, and something that we focus on a lot, because I think ultimately that is going to be the best application of big data, is to really improve the user experience for your users, and that should lead to improved marketing performance, and that's the promise of big data technologies.
So with that in mind, trying to improve the user experience and our marketing efforts, how would you begin harnessing the big data that's available to you? What are your suggestions? Do you have tools, or how would you begin to do that?
So there are a couple of ways. We focus specifically on the SEO space. And so what we do is we try and find opportunities for either finding areas where you might want to learn about it, so spotting trends that you might not be able to see without that sort of processing, or being able to find specific opportunities that you may have gone untouched. So in the SEO space, we're used to fighting the fight in the very visible space, and it all started in how many keywords are you managing and going after and fighting those and doing those ranking positions. But there's also opportunities around, I didn't know that this was an area where I could bring my power of my brand to bear on that, and I could actually fight there and win. And finding those opportunities, not to mention all of the things that we all learned in Search School 101, which one of those matter, and which one of what my competitors doing, and managing all that data. So if you can go out and you can monitor every single one of your competitors' websites and see what they're doing, for instance, that's extraordinarily powerful, but it's also extraordinarily difficult to present that in a way that's useful. So if what you can do is take all those elements and take those unstructured data sets of what does my competitor's website look like, and then use these technologies to find them in sort of pre-formed structures that marketers are used to looking at, they can start to answer those questions in ways they want to. So instead of looking at it as I just have this pile of stuff out there that I don't know how to work at, I want to say I want to be able to slice by where I'm competing and not competing, where I'm having coverage with my other kinds of marketing activities, so where I have paid and natural overlap, where any of those kinds of elements.
Well, you made a good point, because it's not just harnessing the data and grabbing it, it's also how do you make it actionable and format it in a way that marketers can digest easily and the way they need to.
And I don't think it's actually just the way that marketers can digest. I would make a sort of a statement that as marketers, most of our jobs in 5 years will be explaining how the people in our organizations who we all need to get to actually process this, explaining what the big data and analysts and tool sets that we use mean to the rest of the organization. That our job as marketers will stop being, I can go in there and I can run a specific campaign, but it will be about the communication within the rest of the organization on what the actual data means, and that we'll start being those marketers. What is it important? Because with the vast majority of things you can concentrate on, sharing that in your organization, I think everyone here is going to have a very different sort of aspect of that in the next couple of years.
Will or Jeff, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so we're not a provider of big data. Actually, I find big data pretty boring. But the reality is we have to use what you guys are doing in order to make our business better, which I think is one of the reasons we're here. So for example, I think big data is good when it's behind the scenes, as you said, and it's bringing tools to marketers. So as we get more and more voice files and big data crunches that information, we'll transcribe that information, give it to SEO companies, right? But then we'll tag the transcription with metadata about the emotional and sentiment state of the people speaking, which, as you can see, could make SEO and search through SEO much more interesting than it currently is today. So how you do your magic is less important to me, but then the fact that you do it, and we could leverage it, and that for all of you out there, there's a way for you to be entrepreneurial in the way you think and understand about big data and how it could apply to your own businesses.
Yeah, in terms of harnessing it, I'll take a slightly different tack, which is that actually right now it is fairly expensive to harness it in the sense that the skills from an engineering perspective for utilizing these big data technologies in really good ways, and there are better ways than others. They're actually fairly hard to find right now. There's not an employment issue for engineers who are familiar with big data, and I think it's a challenge for everybody who's not really a big technology company. If you look at, I was just looking at Amazon's financials the other day, and they, I think in 2011 they had 48 billion in sales, and they spend about 1.3% of their sales on R&D. So they're spending about $625 million a year on R&D. And I think that as a business scales, you're able to do that. That's going to have advantages. But if you're not doing that today, there's going to be some challenges, I think, in the short term, really accessing some of these technologies and utilizing. So it's a little self-serving to say, but I think working with partners can help in this regard. But I think making investments in your own companies as well, and I think treating this as something that's very early is important. It's still very early in terms of the development of these technologies and in terms of the utilization of these technologies, and so I think it's important to view it as an investment and something that is going to get better with more data, more iteration. And so, I think take a long-term view of these technologies, and that'll really, that'll pay off in the long term.
I think that's an extraordinarily good point. Is you have to figure out what you want to.
The self-serving point for vendors?
No. They figure out what you want to do with it. Although I'll take the other one too. Even just figuring out whether you want to use it to attack a single channel or whether you're looking at it to try and crunch and figure out what's going on across your entire marketing mix is a sort of decision you need to make before you jump into it. Because if you just sort of lump it all together, you're sort of in trouble from the very beginning. And yesterday, one of the interesting things that came up on the panel was the comment around the CFO being the most concerning part of the organization, because this kind of analysis is traditionally done by those kinds of people. And it's like digging through and looking back on what happened yesterday. And as marketers, I think we need to figure out how do we get those conversations forward and back into the marketing purview.
You bring up a good point about other channels. You mentioned how we can apply big data to SEO. Jeff, that was really interesting too, I think, to talk more about how we're going to apply it to voice. With the voice information we can pull, that's going to be fascinating, especially sentiment, because I think that's a big challenge in search, is we don't really understand sentiment just based on a keyword per se.
Yeah, so one of the other panelists earlier, I think from Xenia, said that applying intent and humanity is important to search, right? So if you look at the hundreds of millions of dollars right now being spent on sentiment analysis from Twitter, for example, alone, and basically all they're doing is trying to look at keywords and how keywords relate to each other in a string of text. The reality is it's very difficult to do that with much precision. It turns out with voice that it doesn't matter what language you speak, the same emotions come through no matter what language it is. So whether it's Japanese or Indian or English or Hebrew or French, the same emotions come through when you're speaking, which is really fascinating. And so you can crunch the data to recognize what those emotions are. And it's being done today. Mostly this is starting in the call center world. You can imagine, and Dell is at the front end of this, an angry caller who's had a bad experience calls in, and what they're doing is within 10 seconds, this big data crunch is analyzing their voice and actually targeting them as a particular type of client. Someone who's so angry that you cannot get over what their anger's about, or someone who is in the middle, or someone who, is sort of faking anger a little bit because they want to get a discount. And what happens is that profile's set up, and then immediately, because through now analysis that's being done by social scientists, neuroscientists, and sentiment experts, on the other side, they know what type of response needs to be made to address that person, and all that stuff is on screen in real time, and that takes a huge amount of not only data crunching, but a huge amount of front-end interface experience as well. So it's really interesting where's that going, but it's mostly around sentiment and understanding sentiment and intent.
So what are some other maybe cutting edge or new ways you're seeing big data applied in other channels other than just SEO?
I can, if it's okay, I haven't yet had a chance to talk about the SEO one. So
Go right ahead.
I'll talk a little bit about that, and then also I'll talk about paid search as well. I think big data is very valuable in kind of in drawing insights, but I think it can be taken to the next level, which is actually putting together actions in real time on people's websites. So one of the things we do is we're going to optimize a website for organic search and for paid search. How we do that is part of that is we're optimizing existing pages. The other thing we do is we create new pages to essentially target tail demand. And I think the tail demand is where across, not just SEO, but every single channel is a really big application for big data. Everybody, there's a lot of people that do, especially in this room, that do a really great job on the head. It's worth spending time on that head in terms of figuring out what people are looking for, what's the exact right landing page to send them, optimizing that landing page. But once you get to the tail and you've got a query that only 5 people are using every couple months, the ROI on taking manual efforts becomes problematic. So that's where I think big data can come in, again, all across these channels. In the organics channel, what we do is we will actually go and create pages when we found there's a situation that there is relevant tail demand out there and you currently don't have a good page for that. And we'll take into account a whole bunch of different variables in terms of doing that. What is the demand? What is the supply? We'll also look at your existing pages, making sure that there's no duplication across these pages. And then we'll do a lot to make sure that user experience of these pages is continually kept at a most optimal level. So that would mean as the pricing changes, as the product inventory changes, we'll update those pages. As we look at bounce rates and conversion rates and all these other different pieces of data, we'll continually optimize those pages. If we find that the page is not working or it becomes duplicate with other page, we'll go ahead and no-index those pages. So I think a big application is taking it from analysis to actual real-time dynamic action on people's website. And we see that for tail demand, and we see that being something that can be done across every channel. We started in organic search, but we've just actually introduced a paid search product, which will, in real time, if you're doing a situation where you've got a broad match, say I'm sending everything that contains the keyword sweaters to my sweater page. But then somebody searches for red cardigan sweater, and previously, if they went to that sweater page, there would actually be no red or cardigan sweaters on that page. So that's a bad user experience. So what we're going to do is we'll actually route that user in real time to the better page, a page that contains red cardigan sweaters, and we'll actually add dynamic content on that page that is relevant to red cardigan sweaters in real time. So I think taking big data technologies on the tail and applying them in real time is a big, we see that as a big opportunity across pretty much every channel.
Yeah, I think that the other areas, the marketing automation field is extraordinarily ripe, and they're already capturing some of these things. That data that you collect and that's tied in from your, whether it may start with a display click that goes into an email campaign, and then you're tagged, and then you come back and you get a different experience on your website, right? These are all these are the very definitions of what we want to do with big data, and moving those around. We partner with Adobe, we have a partnership with them, and we provide them information, and then they make bid rule decisions in their paid search aspects from there. So if you're not showing up in natural search, or your competitors are showing up in natural search, that you can actually then go ahead and increase a bid or move around along those there. So there are areas who are other people tying into, our system. I'm sorry, I do only think about search, but it goes from there, and so there's lots of different ways you can use for sort of disparate systems that tie together as well.
It's a good point about marketing automation too, because you can do a lot more lead nurturing based on tying into the big data that you're able to collect and analyze over time too. So that's a really good point. So we've been talking about privacy today throughout the panels. Tell me how you think that privacy issues are going to affect how we collect and use big data going forward.
So I think we talked, there's been other folks who have talked about the actual issues on collection there. One of the foundational issues with big data is that you're used to working with incomplete data sets. Is that, by that very nature, you're less concerned about the individual transaction of any one item than about what the actual overall pattern of behavior can lead to a better experience for that one person who's there right now. And so I think, what we'll see as the very clear and present restriction of some sets of data are going to require us to make smarter and smarter sets of decisions when we have incomplete data. So if you get 14 to 25% of your information from search as not provided, for instance, you have to find other ways to get around that and make your decisions on what does that really mean for my optimization and how do I go against that. And that'll continue to go, is that when you don't have a full set of data set, what kicks in to help you make those decisions and move forward?
So in our neck of the woods, what happens with voice is you tend to be much more personal and more emotional with your voice than you are with text. A little bit less so with video, but nonetheless. So what that means is, as big data allows us to crunch through the analysis of what people say, they'll tend to reveal a little bit more than they would have otherwise with text. So it starts, you start to wonder what that will do to privacy in terms of, well, people are inadvertently now revealing more information than they might have otherwise thought. We already heard that people are already revealing a lot of personal information, but when you say it, and then you can analyze it, and then you could push that the analytics down to the big data crunch area, which is then pushed out to the rest of the world. What does that mean for the person who said something? So I think that, at least in our area, it raises some privacy issues and concerns that are a little bit more important, if you will, than just text-based.
Yeah, I think the privacy, restricting the amount of data that people can use is I think, to be honest, is not going to be optimal for marketers. It's not going to be, if there's less data, that obviously makes our job harder. But I think, to Seth's point, this is a place where big data technologies can add a lot of value, because they can make up for that lack of data, because they are used to your point, working with incomplete data sets. One quick example is, with the no keyword data, I think not getting that data is not great. I think in previous panels, people were talking about how important that data is. But I think there are ways around that. For instance, I could just give you an example of one thing that we're doing. We actually saw this as a problem, because whenever our customers are putting out new products, we were always having a challenge figuring out how people are going to search for those products. When they're really new, you don't actually know how people are going to search for those products. So one of the things we did was actually, we've trained a bunch of language models on a whole set of existing keyword data to understand how people typically search for things. And then when we have information about a new product, we will go and extract the attributes for that product, as well as the product name itself. So if a dress could be green, it could be a lace dress, it could be a party dress or a casual dress, all of those different kinds of attributes. And then what we're able to do is predict how people are going to actually search, because we know typically when you have these kinds of attributes, what is the order in which people will search for these kinds of things. So we'll know that if you have that kind of dress, people will search for green dress or green lace dress, for example. So as the amount of data that we're able to use becomes less, I think somewhat paradoxically, it's going to make the utilization of these technologies even more important to try to extract those insights, given the less amount of data.
What do you think the future holds for big data?
It's definitely more valuations for VC. I think, in the future, the way we're using big data will continue to evolve in a couple different ways. We are going to find that there's a limited number of resources we have every day, whether that's fighting opportunities in certain areas for actual resources on budget or time or where you want to go after. And big data is a way to identify those areas of inefficiency and work them out of the systems. In other words, say you have neglected this and you should be spending more time on it, whether that's you're over-optimizing for a larger set of keywords on there, or you should spend some more time splitting your ad groups into on this because you're not being ideal. It's also going to be a way for people to use that as a weapon to make their channels much more effective. And then the higher levels in the organization, that person who's responsible for all online customer acquisition, for instance, is going to need a very different skill set than those channel people who are saying, I want to optimize the hell out of my particular channel, because they're going to want to know this media mix. How does it help? How do I know what to do, and how do I allocate those individual resources or work as a team and move them together?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that we're in a world where more and more data is collected, and it will continue to be. I think there are a lot of companies here who are doing their own data crunching internally. You're going to get to a point, just like there are now cloud providers which people tap into. There's a layer of big data providers that will be able to help companies out there who get to a point where they don't want to continue investing internally in doing that. There are experts who do that. And so, the future of this industry is all around data and the analysis of data. So big data will just continue to grow, and I think continue to be a part of what everyone here does. I also think it's going to, on the entrepreneurial front, open up a whole new way of people to create and invent new ways to use the ability to crunch that data to look at many, many different aspects of the way they're running their business. We're doing one of them, but there are thousands of others out there that can be created at the same time. So the future is bright, and it's never going to stop.
I think agree with those points. I think there'll be, at one level, I think these technologies will be used more deeply within every single channel. So I think it'll be applied across every single channel that we're working in. And then I think a good future opportunity as well is working across channels. So for instance, I guess one I've always wondered what people think of this, but how many people think that if you have an organic listing on the Google or Yahoo search result page, that it's going to increase your return on ad spend if you also have a paid search? How many people think that's going to improve our return on ad spend? How many people think it will decrease your return on ad spend? Oh, nobody? Okay. How many thinks that'll actually depend? Okay, a few. So I think, I'm not sure we know the answer to that question, but that is the kind of question that big data technologies can be used to apply, because it probably will, like with most things, probably will depend. So if you can have that information to know, when I want to reinforce what I'm doing from an organic perspective, or when I don't want to compete with that, and use that to inform what you're doing on the paid search side, I think that's just one example of how starting to do things across channels and leveraging the data, large-scale data across these channels can help improve, as I said, user experience and also marketing performance.
Yeah, and the last thing is that marketers are becoming more and more the owners of technology budgets and firms, and I think this is going to be something that we have to get used to. Is that as marketers, we need to be managing that like a CIO used to be, and managing that, and the big data fits into that. The marketing, this is a marketing budget kind of a question on how do you deal with these optimizing solutions. So it's going to be on us to keep explaining that to the rest of our organizations and understanding what it means, because we're the ones going to be responsible for it.
If you could leave everybody here with something they should be doing today, to leave here and go back and implement something that will help them understand their businesses better through big data, what is the one gem of wisdom you would leave with them?
No pressure.
No pressure at all.
Okay.
And no sales pitches, right?
Yeah,
No,
I was
it's-
gonna say I could say use our technology,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
that would be
Yeah, that's it.
even more self-serving than my previous points. So, I think the simple thing is get to know these technologies. Do you understand these technologies and start, if you're a marketer that hasn't been familiar with them, try to get some familiarity with them and start talking to people and partnering with people who are using them, because I do think that if you're going to compete in marketing, you're going to be competing against people who are investing very, very large amounts of money, aka Amazon or others if you're a retailer, and it's going to be hard to compete. They have lots of other advantages, but that's they clearly see that as a massive advantage. Jeff Bezos, writes letters about why he's not as profitable, because he's wanting to make massive investments in this technology. So I think that you don't have to. I think you will be able to compete by utilizing these technologies, but I think you need to start getting familiar with them and learning these technologies and how they can help your business.
Yeah, I just also add to that. There's probably somebody in your organization that's already starting to think about this stuff, and find that person and learn from them, and just see what you can do to continually roll down that, and figure out what are the impossible questions that if I had answers to, I could crush everybody else, and then go find people who can get you those answers, whether
They're
they're
probably out
inside,
there.
outside. They absolutely are out there, and they can. And if you can frame the debate on what you want to extract from the data set, whether you want to find that missing data set, you want to find that that insight into what your competitors are doing or what an individual person on your website should be doing. Challenge yourself to figure out those questions that you don't think can be answered right now, and then challenge your organization to answer them for you.
Yeah, I would say big data is a competitive edge. So if you use it the right way, you gain that you gain an advantage over your competitors. So either a couple of things happen. You have enough money, you've been lucky enough to have tens of millions of dollars invested where you're doing it yourself, or you're not in that group and you need to try and create a competitive edge and you need to outsource that. And here is something that many of you may not have known about before this, but by deploying it through providers, it will give you a competitive edge, either to catch up or to stay ahead.
Great. We wanted to open it up to questions. I don't know if there's our Q&A person with the microphone. So does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask the panel today? Got to be something. I'll just add that, I think that also you should try and start, it sounds funny to say, but start small with big data. Don't try and bite off everything at once. I know I don't run a large company, I run a small company, but we still have those needs about data, and it can be very challenging and daunting to figure out how to get started. But just everything in your business can run off of great information from big data. For instance, we were able to pull profitability information through a couple of different APIs and pull it together and churn it together and find out how profitable we are as a company. We were able to create a dashboard for that. For me, that makes me feel like I have a competitive edge because I have information about my business every day that is actionable and I can keep an eye on very easily. But it does take some effort. And like you said, Seth, you got to kind of figure out what it is you want to know and then go after it. But the data is there, and usually it's not necessarily too difficult to get to, but sometimes the crunching of the numbers and the data can be very difficult too.
Yeah, we have folks who are, even after they look at that transition from the unstructured data into a sort of a more structured data where they can slice and dice it, they still look at it. Two companies that are in exactly the same space look at completely different questions on how they want to answer things for the business. And those approaches are prevalent, I think, that, organizations attack these things very different. So even after you've made that transition from unstructured to structured, you still have to figure out, now what do I want to do with it?
Absolutely. Well, you all mentioned too, like Amazon's a great example of a company that does big data well. I think about Target. I don't know if y'all saw the recent story about Target, about how they're able to predict when people are going to have babies, which was a little disturbing to me. I hope I don't get one in the mail and freak out my husband or something. But yeah, they're able to take all this data based on your buying habits and so forth, and turn it together and figure out basically when you might be expecting a baby. And that's fascinating.
Congratulations, Rob.
Yeah. That's fascinating to me as a marketer, that there is, like you said, with Amazon and Target, they have a lot of data they can turn together from multiple channels and areas. What are some other examples of companies that you think do big data well?
Well, I mean, I think unfortunately right now it's a mix of the really big tech companies. Obviously Google, Yahoo, those folks, I think pioneered a lot of this, and then a bunch of startups, I think, that are doing fairly well. It is fascinating though, that Target point we had, I forget his name, but the author of the book, which kind of touted this, shared a story where there was a father who got very angry because Target was sending these coupons for pregnancy things, birth control, and that kind of stuff to his daughter, and sent an angry letter about that. And then when he was later asked about that, he essentially said, "Well, there were some things going on in my house that I was not quite aware of, and now I'm aware of those kinds of things." So it actually was something that scarily predicted something that he was not quite aware of as well. So that comes to some of the if done not. One of the things I think we need to be careful about is if big data is not utilized very well, then I think that will actually going to increase the calls around privacy. And so that's why I think it's critical for people to focus on improving the user experience, not just the marketing performance in terms of utilizing big data. Because if people feel that they're just blatantly being marketed to, they go to a website and they're followed by everything they've ever searched for or looked at on a website, it starts to feel a little creepy, and that will lead to a lot more of these calls that we've been talking about. And so I think that's something we all in the industry need to be careful about.
It's a really good point, because just like retargeting, which can have a creepy factor, if you don't do it well, it has that creepy factor. So I'm sure big data, absolutely, just like the Target situation, can have that somewhat creepy Big Brother factor. We've got to avoid that as an industry.
One thing that you can debate whether it's a positive outcome or not, but the financial industries are absolutely using these technologies to try and predict what's going on in very short amounts of time, and using different data sets and trying to pull in there and making decisions around sort of predictive behavior, and trying to make it not be just how far away can you put the box from the actual exchange, and so they use all those technologies as well. So we run into that all the time on trying to steal great engineers from those folks.
I also think that, at least where I am in Silicon Alley in New York City, a lot of the startups who don't have either the ability to hire in or the experience are using big data in a way that is really innovative. I think when you're in an industry or at a company that's somewhat mature, where you've built a lot of things in-house already, it's going to be harder to move away to those third parties, because you have people who are invested in it, you have infrastructure that's invested in it, and I think those companies are going to have the harder time making the move, where some of the bigger companies who are creating the big data category and some of the smallers who are just utilizing it for their own purposes are the ones who are hopping on this right now.
So would you recommend that people start in-house, or do you think that they should outsource their big data from the get-go?
It depends what question they want to answer. I mean, I think it really absolutely changes, depending on whether there's anybody else solving that problem out there, or even whether it's just that they need someone to help sort of structure their data sets in a way that's not there in a smart way.
I mean, I think if you can do it, and this is not a self-serving point, is that if I think having some amount of this knowledge in-house, it does make a lot of sense. It is something I think is going to be increasingly a basis for competition. But as I said before, that is somewhat challenging to do. So I think probably a smart mix of having folks in-house who are knowledgeable about this, and working with some of the interesting technologies that are coming along the line from external companies is probably a good way of doing it.
I will caution you, if you do go the in-house route, you'll run into the, well, we were right, but not very useful challenge, which is where you'll have someone who will hear your problem and say, okay, I can find out exactly what a single person did, or I can give you a solution that tells you after it's actionable, not to go after that. So it's really important, and I echo that, go in-house where you can, but make sure you manage the expectations on what you're trying to get out of it really, really clearly, because the people who can build these solutions, they may not have the same background or the same experience or actually grok what you're trying to get done in a practical way. And it's very, very, very important to keep going back to that when you're describing what you want them to help you build.
Yeah, I think one caveat on the in-house piece is you've got to make sure that you're doing it well, and so don't do it to the exclusion of leveraging some of the latest technologies. But I think it is very helpful in order to understand what to use to have a lot of that knowledge, have knowledgeable people in-house.
For us, there's no way we would do this in-house. We have other priorities. Our platform is a B2B2C. I'm not even close to being ready to hire big data experts in-house. I probably will never do that. So I think it depends on what your business is, depends on what you're doing. We're an application that's using big data as opposed to the other way around. And for that, at least in the space that we're in, I think a lot of other consumer-facing or B2B2C facing companies, yes, when you get to a certain size, but that has to be pretty big in order to start bringing that in-house, my opinion.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Oh, Lori, do you have a question?
How much does it cost to do big data well, serve per ad, and what calculation goes into determining that? And are companies like Target and Walmart using their experience in the supply chain and RFID to do it well online as well?
Cost. So again, I think depending on what you're trying to do, but if you're trying to do a big or small project, that obviously will have an effect. I think the cost it's actually the engineers who can do this are paid very well. So I think so that's hard. Just finding those folks is difficult, and you need a certain number of them in order to really be able to get anywhere. On the flip side, one thing that is great is that a lot of the infrastructure is becoming very inexpensive to start with. So we actually run everything we do on Google, on Amazon AWS, so the Amazon Web Services, and so that allows people, you can access farms of machines in order to do map reduces and things like that via that service. So the cloud services are actually making the technology fairly easy to access. The challenge is more getting the people who know how to access it and doing it in a way that you're really going to have an impact. You've got to figure out what to do and what to work on. So those, I think, are the biggest challenges. With the cloud services, the actual cost is fairly small to start with.
And this to start with is the key there. I mean, you can get a small Amazon box pretty cheaply. When you then start pulling down the entire web and processing it, it quickly rolls. And then that's when even more you rely on those great engineers who can help structure that data. And the difference between a great engineer and an okay engineer will be a massive cost structure in your actual cost of goods. So being able to think through that from the very beginning is really key. I don't know if that answers it.
Per ad? Right. Well, I think, so then, you know, no, I don't think from a per ad, because it does depend on what you're doing. I mean, I'll say, you know, if you go to, you know, companies like ourselves, our service is actually provided on a CPC basis, so like on a per ad basis, and that is based purely on the economics of your business. So, you know, our service will be whatever CPC makes sense for you to have a good ROI, essentially. And we've offered our service in that kind of model to make it very easy for people to get started. I think that's also something that is coming with big data technologies, is people are doing it largely on a performance or usage basis. And so ours is on a pure performance basis. The idea is that there's very little risk to start, and we're only going to get paid if it performs, if it's going to improve the user experience, improve the relevance of your content, and that's going to lead to more traffic on the organic side or more conversions on the paid search side. So our paid search product is also an example of that, where you know, our value proposition is we're going to increase your paid search conversion by 20%, and we're going to get paid on basically a rev share on that 20% incremental profit that you're gaining. And again, based on the economics of your particular business. So if you're selling jewelry, it'll probably be a little bit more expensive than if you're, you know, selling, you know, clothing or you know, other kind of lower priced items.
Okay, I think that we're going to wrap it up. So thank you to my panelists today, and please see them later if you have some more questions.